He thought he had lost everything 6 years ago, until the rain handed it back. The city had been a mirror that evening, every light doubled on the wet asphalt. Henrique Valença pulled his coat tighter and slowed his car as the street narrowed beneath the bridge. A woman crouched beneath a blue tarp beside a row of closed storefronts, 3 small heads pressed together like a single bloom. For a heartbeat, he did not move. The windshield wipers made a steady, indifferent sound, and the world tightened down to that one figure, the familiar tilt of her jaw. Lívia. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, streaks of grey at the temple he had not been ready to recognize. The children, 3 boys, stared at the rain, each face so like the others, it was impossible at first to tell where one ended and the next began. They wore mismatched jackets, the kind handed out at shelters, and one of them clutched a torn paperback like a talisman. Henrique killed the engine without thinking. The sound cut through the rain, as if policy and practice could be isolated by silence. The tarp sagged with water. Lívia looked up, and for a second time the years collapsed. Her eyes found his and then darted away, not surprise, not relief, but a calculation that had been practiced for a long time. He stayed in the car because every step held the risk of being pretended away, of being told he had imagined her. He watched her tuck the smallest boy behind her back, smothering a smile that was only for her, a private thing. He saw the way her fingers brushed a child's hair with the kind of gentleness he had once thought reserved for him. When she stood, the tarp hissed like a small animal. She adjusted the children, gathering them close, and in the split second before she moved, they seemed to fuse into a single silhouette. 3 identical cores of breath and warmth. Lívia bolted, not toward him but away, quick practice steps between the parked cars, a movement that said the street had been her defense as long as she could remember. Henrique found himself outside the car, the rain getting into his collar, not thinking of the 100 things he might have done, no call, no plan, only moving after her. As he followed, she slowed for a moment and looked back. Her face was no longer the camera-ready woman from his memory, but it was no less fierce. Her glance carried every accusation she had refused to speak when she left his life 6 years earlier. His name formed in her mouth and did not come out. "If this opening grabbed you, hit like and tell us where you're watching from," a voice might have said over the footage if this had been a story made to sell shock. But Henrique was not ready for a voice. He had a driver, Jonas, and a father, Alberto, who had taught him how to control the narrative, how to keep the world from moving so fast the past could be seen. That training had not prepared him to watch his past walk away in the rain. He lost track of her at the corner. She slipped into a courtyard and vanished into a door that read, "Shelter for Women and Children." The sound of the rain grew muffled, like something happening in another room. Henrique stood under the awning, the water darkening the fabric above his head. He felt absurdly and sharply like a man who had been given a glimpse of a life he no longer owned. The photos arrived the next morning. They came in a plain envelope slipped under the driver's side door of his sedan, the seal dusted with ash. He opened it in the privacy of his office, the city sprawled below like a patient waiting for a word. The pictures were taken across several months. Lívia with the boys at the shelter, Lívia painting small canvases on a battered table, Lívia asleep on a cot with an arm around 2 sleeping heads. One photo showed her standing with her back to a mural, a single broad stroke of blue that made the boys look like they were standing against the sea. The boys' faces were captured looking at the camera with solemn, grown-up eyes that did not belong to children their age. There was also a paper, a photocopy of what at first looked like a bank notice. Henrique scanned the line items, a transfer, last names, account numbers. His name did not appear there. Lívia's did, a signature, a scrawl he thought he recognized. He set the sheet on the desk and ran his thumb along the edge, feeling the ridged texture of photocopied ink, as if that could tell him anything about intent. He tried calling the shelter. Staff gave a clipped professional answer and a person to speak with, Cecilia Prado, the shelter assistant. When Henrique told her who he was and why he needed to see Lívia, there was an infinitesimal pause. The woman was kind in a dry way that came from long experience with people whose problems arrived fully formed and messy. "Mr. Valença, we have a policy to protect the privacy of the women here," Cecilia said. "But I can tell you that there is a woman named Lívia who is here with 3 boys." That should have been enough, an acknowledgement that burned like acid. Instead, the admission widened him like air entering a vacuum. "Is she safe?" he asked. "She is," Cecilia answered, "as safe as any of us can make them." Henrique arranged a visit. His driver Jonas drove with a steady, quiet presence, someone accustomed to turning sudden directions into ordinary motions. On the way, Henrique told him as little as possible and as much as his hands shaking aloud. Jonas listened, then said without judgment, "You should let her lead. People like that, when they've made a life alone, they're good at keeping the doors shut." At the shelter, the light was warm and tired, thick with detergent and the smell of coffee. The walls bore murals painted by residents, swaths of color that tried to make the place less institutional and more like a series of outside impressions people wanted to remember. Henrique felt the corporate straight lines of his own life fray as he walked through the common room. Women were there, folding clothing, speaking in low voices. Children raced through corridors with cardboard swords. He found Lívia near the painting table, the same table from the photographs, a small canvas propped up in front of her. She had a baby on her hip now, one of the twins awake and watching the room with solemn curiosity. When Henrique entered, the air around her tightened. "Henrique," she said, a single name as if that could close the distance they had measured with years. "Lívia," he answered. The name tasted like an apology that had not been spoken often enough. She did not flee. She did not invite him in. She kept the children between herself and his questions. Her voice had been trained to be wary. The 6 years had tightened her like a seam. "What are you doing here?" he asked, soon enough that she had not decided whether to answer. She looked at the boys. "I'm doing what I have to," she said. "They are mine." There was no drama in the words. There was only fact. The silence that followed felt like a courtroom recess. "You left," he said. "The accusation had been ready in him for years. You left without telling me." She did not deny it. She held herself like a woman who had practiced songs of omission until they had become memory. "I had to go," she said. "You were young, Henrique. You had everything to lose. I thought if I stayed, I would make you lose it." Old guardianship clashed with new realities. Henrique imagined Alberto, his father, in his office on the 23rd floor, hands steepled over a ledger, deciding which stories were affordable and which were not. He imagined his father's name as a scale that weighed everything, including the life of a woman who had once been his. "How long?" he asked, softer. "Almost 6 years," she answered. The shelter would not let him take the children to a cafe for interrogation. That would have been absurd. He sat apart from them and watched as she braided a strap into a small woven toy. The boys watched him like they were learning the contours of a new face to fit into their world. At one point, the smallest of the 3, Miguel, came to the table holding a damnable curiosity in his hand. He had the same high forehead as the others, hair that fell in a straight line above the eyes. A photograph lay in his palm, a battered rectangle of gloss with a crease down one edge. "Is this him?" Miguel asked, and the question was simple enough that it cut through the adult complexity. Henrique looked. The photograph was of a man in one of the city's parks, a weekend shirt, a hat tilted back. The face was not immediately recognizable, but it had the same base of a jaw, the same casual defiance. Henrique tilted the picture and the boy pointed, quick as a map. "He's the man from the picture," Miguel said, "the one you showed us." Henrique had not shown them any pictures. He looked at Lívia and saw a shift in her, a small movement of spine that was almost invisible. She had been preparing for this moment. This was why she had been careful all these years. The children had been given stories to tell the world that reached no further than a blanket and a hand. The shelter visit ended with no break in the tension. Lívia let him leave because she had learned, perhaps she believed, that distance was the only armor she could afford. When he walked back out into the rain, the city seemed less a place of light and more a host of questions that had been left unsigned. Back at his office, Henrique could not let it go. He had been raised to read a ledger like a confession. Money did not lie. Bank statements were stubborn witnesses. He sent a message to Aline, the ex-accountant who had once worked in his father's firm. She had left under ambiguous circumstances 3 years before and lived now on the edges of the corporate network, a node of quiet knowledge. Aline answered, terse and professional, but with a sliver of something that told him she was willing to look. He walked the archive with her 2 afternoons later. The company's files were a disordered forest of binders and boxes, yellowing paper and the faint chemical smell of ink that had been left too long in a closed space. Aline worked with the slow concentration of someone who had unpeeled truth from paper before. They found a series of entries labeled under Project Avelar, a name that had meant nothing to Henrique until now. The paperwork was dense, transfer authorizations, client attestations, a sheet that carried a signature in a hurried, decisive slant, Lívia's name again. Beside it, notes in a different hand, numbers adjusted, a line item crossed, and then re-entered with an explanation that made the hair rise on Henrique's arms. Aline pointed at the signature. "People's hands have small tendencies," she said, as if speaking about handwriting was the same as describing clouds. "But you don't often forge a woman's name without a reason, without someone who benefits." Henrique felt the office room turn colder. The documents were not proof of crime so much as proof of orchestration. The transfers had been rerouted into shell accounts and logged under file names meant to obscure rather than clarify. The victim was listed as Lívia. The beneficiary, indirect but traceable, was listed in shorthand that read, like the old ledger, Valença Holdings, trustee. He thought of his father, of the way the man had always spoken of legacy, as if it were a narrow house to be defended against trespassers. He thought of the conversations at dinners where loyalty was currency and reputation an asset. He thought of the way his father had once told him, in a voice without softness, that love could be dangerous if it endangered a name. When Henrique confronted Alberto, the father did not break into confession. Alberto's hands folded over the desk in the way they always did, like a man folding up a world into something manageable. "Why would you do this?" Henrique asked. He did not mean the signature. It was the absence of truth that occupied him. "Why would you let her disappear?" Alberto's face was unexpectedly brittle. There was a moment where the facade slipped, and Henrique saw a bone-deep fear he had never been granted before. "You were young," Alberto said. "There were deals on the table that would not have survived a scandal. I protected the family. I protected you." "You protected the empire," Henrique said, angrier than he intended. "You meant the name." "Names matter," Alberto said. He sounded older than his years, like someone who had spent nights rehearsing the syllables of his own salvation. "We did what had to be done." Henrique left the room with the taste of old money on his tongue. He felt the ledger entries like little splinters under his skin. The company's press team was hastily called in the days that followed. Henrique could see the way correspondence moved through the offices. Phrases softened here, a line of damage control there. He saw the first small hints of a story beginning to form in the undercurrent of the city's papers. A missing woman, a homeless shelter, human interest angles that would not, on their own, topple empires. But Henrique had seen the scant ledger lines that made empires tremble. He had watched Aline trace a signature and say, in a voice without cadence, This is not her hand. Whoever folded that paper used a strategy: chop, reroute, disguise. You think my father did it? Henrique asked. She had a motive to leave, Aline said. Motives can be manufactured. Henrique began to move differently through his life. The Valença car that had escorted him to dinners and boardrooms became a machine for going places he did not have answers for. He slept badly. He rehearsed conversations he would have with Lívia and then discarded them as soon as they were formed. His nights became a gallery of what-if hypotheses. Between the lines of his corporate existence, little hands were building a home on the other side of the city. In the shelter, Lívia taught the boys to mix pigments for a painting she could never sell. She told them stories of sea voyages in which the smallest always found the best hiding places. She made bread on days when the shelter could afford it and taught the boys to fold paper boats and slide them along the rain gutters. The more Henrique learned about the shelter, the more he was conscious of the fact that her life had turned inward, away from the glare he had once inhabited. She had cloistered herself in a place that refused spectacle. She had become, in many ways, a presence who could be watched from a distance, but not owned. The first real crack in the armor came when Henrique visited the shelter again with an envelope of photographs. He wanted to build a bridge that started with apology and then asked for absolution. He wanted a chronology. Where had she slept? What had she eaten? How had the boys ended up in the world without a last name that could be traced to a Valença ledger? Lívia listened to him with the same unreadable expression, as if weighing each syllable in the balance of survival. There was a moment when one of the boys, Rafael this time, misplaced his bravery and looked straight at Henrique. "Are you him?" Rafael asked, the small voice sharp with the logic of a child. "Are you the man in the stories?" Henrique swallowed. The shelter had taught children to be pragmatic. They had been issued explanations for adult absences that were simple and safe: work, travel, mistakes. He did not know which story they had been given. He did not know which story he would be allowed to inhabit. "I am Henrique," he said, because it was more honest than any excavation he could attempt. The boys did not have a last name to offer him. They had 3 first names that matched like notes in a chord: Miguel, Rafael, Daniel, triplets whose faces were mirror images of each other, multiplied by the randomness of nature and a woman's stubborn will to keep them alive. On his own, Henrique began to piece together the documents Aline had highlighted. There was a pattern to the forgeries if you looked at it long enough. The handwriting, the way certain initials were rounded, the light but decisive corrections that seemed to belong to a steady hand used to writing other men's fates. He started to see his father's fingerprints, not in the inky smudge of a confession, but the architecture of a plan. The media caught a whiff of it, the way they do with anything that hints of a human heart cutting through a corporate veneer. A columnist wrote about the missing fiancé, and a talk show host prodded the topic like someone trying a sore tooth. Henrique watched the coverage with anesthetized interest. The papers were not writing about signatures and shell accounts. They were writing about love and loss. The shelter received visitors, people with good intentions who wanted to help, and the shelter staff learned the curve of public curiosity, how it rose fast and left quickly. Public curiosity was an animal Henrique had never liked. It did what his father could not. It demanded exposure without patience for nuance. When a journalist finally phoned and asked for comment, Henrique hesitated, then said nothing. He was learning, painfully, that his silence had teeth. Aline's work produced a new piece of the puzzle, a ledger entry with a bank code that led to an offshore entity. The trail ended there, in a place where secrecy was the product and paper the currency. The handwriting in the ledger matched the margin notes on the photocopy of Lívia's supposed signature. Whoever had rerouted the funds had wanted the name of a woman to be the buffer, a peel of skin between the money and the truth. It was an old tactic. Use a minor visible casualty to keep the main body of the organization intact. Henrique felt the quality of his life shift, as if he had tilted the house and found a hollow beneath a floorboard. The money that had been his inheritance was suddenly complicated by the lives it had touched. He had been prepared to inherit an empire. He had not been prepared to inherit responsibility for a woman's disappearance. When he confronted Alberto again, it was not in the hushed privacy of the office, but in the glare of the family dining room, where photos of ancestors smiled down like magistrates. There was an apparatus of family history, paintings, names, dates. Alberto's hands moved like placards through the air. "You knew about the transfers?" Henrique asked. Alberto did not look surprised. "I knew things were made to run smooth," he said. "Hard choices are part of management. We choose what to protect." "You chose to protect yourself," Henrique said, and the words, once spoken, had a clarity that felt dangerous. "Names are the currency of a dynasty," Alberto said. "We paid in private to keep the market calm. You paid with a life." Henrique's voice was flat. "You signed her life away." A silence thicker than rain followed. The patriarch's face had the fragile look of someone who had been carved out by the very tools he used to shape others. There was no admission in Alberto's eyes, only a defiant blankness that said sacrifice was part of survival. Henrique left as if a rope had been cut. He called Jonas on the drive home. Jonas's voice was level. "You should be careful," he said. "Sometimes people who have held a family together would rather it stay that way." "Sometimes families break in order to live," Henrique replied, and the line went quiet. The city started to feel like an apparatus of choices he had not consented to. Names, he realized, were both armor and weapon. His father had used them as both. He began to spend nights looking through the shelter's photographs and his own family albums, overlaying images as if the past could be mapped by ink. He found a picture of himself and Lívia at a gallery opening from years ago. In the corner of the frame was a small man with the same jaw as in the photograph Miguel had waved at the shelter. The man's hat was a different color, the background different, but the line of his mouth was the same. Henrique's obsession took on the method of research. He visited the bank where the accounts had been opened and learned the vocabulary of obfuscation. He subpoenaed nothing. He was not ready to escalate into a public war. He wanted the truth to come to him in documents he could hold. He kept his discoveries among friends he could trust, Aline, Jonas, and a lawyer he had known since law school who spoke in cautions. Each whisper of proof widened the crack in his allegiance to the Valença name. Meanwhile, in the shelter, daily life was as simple and as brutal as any honest work. Meals, schooling, medic visits. Lívia carved time for painting and for teaching the boys to recognize certain names, those who had been kind, those who had left or been left. She kept stories of a different life like small, smuggled objects. She avoided explanations that changed the children's world into one of shame. Instead, she taught them to find music in rain, to fold paper into little boats, and race them down gutters when the city ran its streaks of bourbon and gold into the drains. On a wet Tuesday, cots arranged in a row, Henrique arrived at the shelter with a new document clutched in his hand. A page of internal memos he had managed to secure. Aline had flagged one passage, annotations in the margins where someone had written, "Handle quietly and for priority disposal." Henrique folded the paper in half like a letter and for a moment allowed himself the luxury of imagining revelation as an act that would restore order. He placed the paper on the table between them. "This is why I think you were forced," he said. She glanced at it and then closed her eyes, a small, tired movement that made him understand what the months had done to her. "Why would you think I let them do anything?" she asked. Her voice held bitter amusement, like someone who had played a bad joke on fate and lost. He wanted to explain himself, to tell her that he had been fighting in his own way, through ledgers, signatures, the slow arithmetic of screening accounts. But every sentence fell under the weight of what he had known before he had seen her in the rain. He had been sheltered by 100 small lies curated by his father. How did you apologize for a life of ignorance? Lívia looked at the boys, 3 little islands of concentration, and then at him. If you truly wanted to help, she said, you will stop pretending we can be fixed by proof. She was not asking him for evidence, for restitutions, or for public statements. She was asking for a different kind of presence, an absence of pretense. It was an accusation that had no easy end. Days later, Aline called with the kind of measured urgency that meant she had more than hunches. I found something in the back files, she said. A ledger entry that points to a deposit. It's small, quick, but the name used to hide the transfer is her name. Signed and authorized in a way that looks like she consented. Henrique felt the floor tilt. You're sure? Not entirely, Aline said, but the handwriting, there are idiosyncrasies that match a sample we found in the company's ledgers. Somebody wanted us to see her name on paper. That night he dreamed of signatures, rows of them marching like soldiers. The dream had no moral center. It only repeated the way ink could stand in for life. When he pressed Alberto again, the argument felt old and tired. We did what we had to, Alberto said. We make choices for the greater good. Henrique thought of the boys asleep together on cots. He thought of Lívia's hands, stained with paint. The greater good built a wall between my life and the reality of what you did, he said. Alberto's mouth formed into the thin, practiced smile of someone who had always believed in cause. Families make sacrifices. Not everyone gets to decide who sacrifices, Henrique said. He felt anger like a current running through him, surprising in its velocity. Alberto's face changed. Not into contrition, but into a species of fatigue. Your name will survive, he said. That matters. Not to me, Henrique said. The words were not as bold as he wanted them. They felt like a telescope looking into an economy of consequences that he could not fully command. But they were enough to start a fissure between what he had inherited and what he might become. Aline's findings steeped into the air like a rumor. The board prepared statements. The press prepared questions. Henrique received a call from a journalist who had been given a tip from an anonymous source and asked whether the company had anything to comment on regarding alleged improper transfers. Henrique listened to the list of accusations, some true, some misdirected, and decided he could not answer them all. He chose not to speak because he wanted the truth to be handled not by his public relations team, but by an internal unraveling he could feel himself compelled to control. But control is a fragile thing. The world leaned towards spectacle. One evening, as he pulled into the parking lot beneath the family building, his phone buzzed with a message. Have you seen this? It was a short clip from a social feed. Someone had filmed the shelter's mural and, in the background, 3 little faces. The comments asked whether this was the missing fiancé. Henrique shut off his phone and sat in the idling car until the engine stilled in his bones. When he went back to the shelter after that, he realized the walls had grown thinner. There were people at the edge of the property who wanted to offer help and people who wanted to offer headlines. The shelter staff did their best to turn attention into resources, donations, volunteers. But the fragility of privacy was a splintered thing. A week later, a small earthquake happened so quietly it might have been lost if it had not contained precisely the right weight. A child running into the common room with a scrap of paper in his fist, breathless, eyes wide as if the world had just handed him something heavy. Henrique was there when the boy burst in. He had been speaking with Cecilia about food supplies when Miguel, the same child who had held the photograph, came onto the floor with paper clutched like a flag. "Look, look!" he shouted. His voice had a raw edge that made everyone look up. He ran to the table and laid the paper down, as if it were an offering. The room grew quieter than rain. The paper was folded twice. It had coffee stains at one corner and a faint tear along an edge. Someone had taped it in a childish attempt to keep it whole. Henrique felt the hairs rise on his arms the way they always did when the tissue of meaning was about to be ripped. Cecilia bent to pick it up, hands practiced and careful. "Where did you find it?" she asked. Daniel, the middle child, pointed toward a toy chest. "In the book," he said. "In the notebook where she keeps the drawings. I saw a corner. I thought it was a drawing, but it had writing." Henrique's chest tightened. Paper as a device had been a motif long before he knew it. Signatures, transfers, photocopies. This was not an official document by the shape, the folding. It was a private thing someone might tuck away and forget. Cecilia set the paper on the table like it was a fragile relic. Henrique's hands hovered, unsure whether they had permission. His palms felt damp. The moment between holding and opening lengthened until it seemed to have dimensions. Lívia stood a little way off, the three boys, aligned with the same tightness they always formed. She watched the paper like a woman who understood the danger of an open secret. Her face was shut like a book. The expression held something that looked like resignation and perhaps a sliver of fear. Henrique's fingers closed over the edge of the folded page. He thought of all the things signatures had done, hidden things, forged things, claimed things. His thumb brushed the surface, and there was a slight grit of charcoal and smudge of ink. He inhaled the smell of the paper, the shelter, the persistent scent of safety rubbed into fabric. "No one forces a person to do anything," Alberto had told him once, but the world contradicts the neatness of such phrases. Henrique hesitated. In that premium absence, he understood the choice he would have to make if the page contained the things he suspected. Truth had a price measured in reputations and nameplates. There was also a price measured in the small, loud lives that breathed at his feet. He unfolded the paper. The first line he saw was cursive, not long, a hand that trembled and then steadied into clarity. The words were simple, the kind of sentence someone writes because they think they will be understood long after their voice stops being heard. He had not, could not, be prepared for the weight of the words. And then, before his eyes could take in the rest, a child behind him squealed, and the paper slipped in his hands, as if gravity, suddenly aware of its duty, pulled it away. Henrique caught it before it hit the table edge again. The paper trembled between his fingers, a physical qualm he had not had with ink before. The room held its breath. The rain tapped a soft rhythm on the shelter windows, like a metronome counting down a life altered by letters. Henrique's mouth went dry. He looked up at Lívia and saw, for the first time in all the hours of his searching, the full measure of what she had been guarding. There was still so much he did not know. How the ledger had been structured, what deals had been struck in smoke-filled rooms, who had pressed pens into hands that were then presented like veils. But the page in his hand promised to change the geometry of the house he had been taught to occupy. Miguel leaned against the table, eyes like coins. "Is it the one?" he asked, as if names were the key to nights of stories. Henrique did not answer. Instead, he smoothed the paper with both hands and read the next line, and the letters on the page rearranged themselves into a map of motives, a little confession, a narrow kind of love that had been willing to disappear so another could continue. He read the words 3 times before the world seemed to compile itself. The sentence, short, decisive, said, in effect, that she had signed because she was threatened, that she had been told lies meant to make her leave, that she had left to protect him, that in the silence she had made of herself, she had safeguarded his future. The room lunged forward with the sudden sensation of being too small for a feeling. Henrique's knees threatened to fold under him. The men in his life, the man who had built an empire, the man who had inherited it, felt smaller. their actions refracted through the narrow light of a woman's sacrifice. Lívia had not been careless or foolish. She had been strategic in the manner of anyone who has to choose between being seen and being saved. He read on, but the words were not simply facts. They were a small domestic theology, explanations that made sense of absences and framed a reason in tones that were not excuses. She wrote about threats whispered across rooms. She wrote about a forged signature she had been forced to apply. She wrote about a man, Henrique, whose life she had chosen to withdraw from, because the cost of staying had been unbearable. The last lines were short and could be read like an oath. She loved him. She had protected him, and she had taken on the weight of being erased. Henrique felt the paper vibrate in his hands. He did not know whether he wanted to hurl it into the middle of the room and force a public reckoning, or to fold it and keep it for the private sensation that it no longer belonged to the ledger, but to a human heart. It was not a legal confession. It was not an indictment written in a court's language. It was a human thing, a handmade instrument of truth that demanded to be read not by the press or the board, but by the people who lived the consequences. He looked up at Lívia. The shelter's fluorescent lights made small halos around her head. Her face was not a mask, but it was a guarded thing that had been taught to keep the important parts hidden. Her lips were pressed into a line that might have been a smile if wrought with less pain. "Did you write that?" he asked. She nodded slowly, and in her eyes was an exhaustion that belonged to a person who had been carrying 3 sleeping bodies through nights of rain, and a silence that was more useful than any public defense. Henrique's world split into before and after, like a page torn down the middle. He felt the old alliances sag under the new geometry of evidence and affection. He also felt suddenly that the choice he would make next would not simply define his relationship to a father or a family name, but mark the axis of whatever man he would become. He could cover the letter with corporate language and file it away in a drawer, or he could let it be what it was, a small, stubborn instrument that demanded action. The rain outside slowed, a timid percussion on the windows, as if the city itself had been listening and now hesitated, curious about the shape of the coming hours. Henrique folded the paper with the care of someone placing a live thing into a safe. He stood, and in that motion there was a sense that paths were being chosen, one that would lead back to the boardroom and the rooms where decisions were made, and one that would lead out into the narrower streets where children learned how to sew beads onto a life that had been unraveled. He had in his hand a piece of paper that could topple a quiet. He had in his heart a memory of a woman he had loved, who had been willing to stop existing for his sake. And he had, finally, the knowledge that the name he had been given would no longer be the only thing he could be asked to carry. When he left the shelter that afternoon, the rain had stopped. The pavement steamed in the air. Miguel and his brothers were inside, and for the first time in a long time, Henrique felt as though the closed chapters of his life had begun to buckle toward the light. He walked away with the paper in his pocket, and the sound of a city that had long rehearsed indifference seemed to tilt toward consequence. He left the shelter with the folded page pressed into his breast pocket, its edges warm from the shelter's indoor heat. The city had a new clarity. The steam from gutters rose in thin columns, and the sidewalks were wiped clean by the earlier rain. Henrique walked with a cadence that felt foreign, each step a negotiation between the life he had been given and the life he now knew had been hidden. The following days were a tight incision of movement. Calls, sealed envelopes, private meetings where the words "for internal review" and "confidential" echoed like ritual responses. He did not want the letter to be a weapon brandished for spectacle. He had read it as a plea. He felt it needed to steer conduct, not just headlines. Still, once the content existed in his hands, it could not be contained. The ink had already begun its work. Aline compiled the ledger anomalies into a neat packet. Her skill was the stubbornness of someone who believed paper could be translated into truth. She highlighted the forged authorization and traced the route through intermediary accounts. Each line she underlined was a small revelation and a new liability. Henrique sat in the archive room until the lights dimmed behind them and the floors hummed with the building's night breath. He thought of the boys' faces, of Lívia's careful economy of words, and he began to understand how the calculus of privilege had allowed a man's fear to become another person's erasure. He asked Aline to hold the files for him. He could have gone to the public prosecutor, could have handed over the documents, and let the law churn them into motion. But he also understood how exposure might hurt the very people he wanted to protect, the shelter, the children, Lívia, so he fashioned his own path. He would confront Alberto first, privately, with what he had learned, and force a reckoning that started inside the house that had built the lie. He chose the family dining room for the confrontation because the room carried the heavy weight of legibility. Portraits of ancestors, the long table polished smooth by generations of hands. Alberto sat at the head, a man whose posture was habitually in command. The light fell hard on his cheekbones and sharpened his thin mouth. "You did this," Henrique said. He laid the photocopies of ledger entries and the child's letter on the table like evidence. The letter's folded corner was visible. The handwriting could be recognized by anyone who had loved and lost. Alberto's face tightened into a look Henrique had seen before, an industry of denial. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" he asked, a professional's question, designed to narrow the field. Henrique placed the photocopies between them. "This," he said, "the transfers routed through shell accounts, the signature forged. Lívia's name used as a buffer. You protected the family, and in the process, erased a life." For a moment Alberto said nothing. The silence collected like dust. "We were protecting an institution," he said finally. "You know how it is. Sometimes unpleasant measures must be taken to protect the greater good." "The greater good," Henrique repeated, feeling an old fury rise new and sharp. "You built the greater good on someone else's absence." Alberto's jaw worked. There was a time when his words would have settled the room. Now they felt threadbare. He had cultivated a world in which decisions were abstract and casualties were numbers. Henrique had grown up believing in the sanctity of that abstraction. The letter in his pocket dismantled it with the care of someone undoing stitches. "You don't have to tell me what to feel," Alberto said finally with a brittle attempt at command. "You're still young. You'll see the necessity." Henrique could see the old fear in Alberto's eyes, the fear of scandal, of loss of control, not surprised anger, but the genuine panic of a man who had made his life a continuous exercise in damage limitation. It was not nobility, it was calculation. Henrique had admired that calculation for years. Now it felt like treason. "You will give me names," Henrique said. "You will give me explanations. You will answer the questions you have been hiding behind for 6 years." He folded the letter so that no one could read it, like a relic returned to its shrine. Alberto's shoulders dipped. "I can't undo what's been done," he said. "I tried to do what was best for the family." "Then start doing what's best for the people you harmed," Henrique replied. "Start by telling the board the truth." When Henrique left the house that afternoon, the air felt thin. He did not know if Alberto would comply. He only knew that the truth existed now in a tangible form that could not be unmade. The first public tremor arrived in a terse, formal notice that circulated through corporate channels within 48 hours. An independent review would be initiated into financial irregularities related to Project Avelar. The board called an emergency session. Journalists began to ask questions in corridors. The city's press, hungry for the drama of private life colliding with public power, began to speculate. Henrique watched the news cycle unfold, like watching a simmer finally finding a boil. He watched Alberto move with the measured composure of a man who believed he could spin the narrative back into his control. He watched Aline hand him documents wrapped in legal caution, and he watched Jonas stand a little farther from the household commotion than he had before, a professional whose loyalty had been quietly shifting since the shelter. The board meeting was clinical, fluorescent, and full of people who had not expected to be asked to account for the moral calculus of protecting a reputation. Henrique sat among them and felt the old family portrait on the wall become an accusation. Directors asked for time, for counsel, for an explanation that would not and could not be fully provided. When the board voted to commission an independent audit and to cooperate with authorities, should the inquiry require it, a small, tremulous relief passed through Henrique. It was not victory. It was a first step. But public processes are not neat. The press learned of the shelter photographs and published them with a prudence that attempted sympathy but landed clumsy. Speculation about the missing fiancé returned like a persistent tide. The shelter received calls. Some offered help, some offered intrusive questions. Henrique began to feel his private shame amplified by the public stage. Then, when the pressure bore down hardest, Alberto collapsed. He was in his study preparing an address for shareholders, papers fanned across his desk like fallen leaves. He had always equated his body's endurance with his will to command. A call he took from a board member, the voice clipped, the accusations in it a mirrored image of what Henrique had said only days earlier. The next thing anyone knew, Alberto was on the floor, a neighbor's assistant and a hastily summoned doctor attending to him. He was taken to the hospital. The initial bulletin cited a severe stress-related episode. The language in the media was careful. Medical emergency, hospitalized, stable condition. The family's spokespeople asked for privacy. The image of Alberto, hooked up to machines, his face slack and pale under hospital lights, was a stark contrast to the man who had always seemed sculpted by iron. Whatever else his life had been, he had been masterful at choosing which needlepoints of pain to keep hidden. Now some of those hidden pains had become visible in the most ordinary medical terms: fatigue, strain, shock. His collapse did not excuse his actions. It made the consequences that much more human and less easily dismissed as mere corporate necessity. Henrique sat in the sterile waiting room and for the first time in years felt the intimate, involuntary compassion he had not allowed himself. He watched an old man reduced to fragility and understood that revenge would not repair anything, but accountability still needed to happen. The investigations moved forward. The independent auditors requested documents. Regulators issued notices. The press published more of the shelter photographs alongside excerpts of the letter. Small lines that made plain what had been orchestrated, that a woman's signature had been pressed into service as a buffer to protect an empire. The word forgery began to appear in headlines, but always with careful modifiers. Alleged, under investigation. Henrique sometimes caught himself wishing the world would move with the certainty he felt in his chest. But the law and the press moved by different rhythms, and he learned patience. Alberto's condition prompted statements from the company. He was, the statement said, taking a leave of absence while the family and company addressed the issues. The optics were clumsy. Accusations were surfacing. At the same time, a man lay in a hospital bed. People on the street argued about whether the family was being punished or whether the man had been made a victim of his own system. Henrique avoided television interviews. He thought about the letter folded in his pocket and how private things can shift public lives. Lívia watched the headlines with an economy of attention. She could never unsee the effect of exposure on her children. She had chosen invisibility for reasons that, after the letter was read aloud to him in the shelter, Henrique now understood with painful clarity. Where the world wanted to make her a symbol or a story, she wanted something else: stability for 3 small lives. She kept painting, and the canvases became larger and less about selling than about making a place that smelled of sea or bread for the boys to inhabit in their imaginations. Cecilia continued to work at the shelter with a tact that was almost ceremonial. She shepherded donations, filtered volunteers, and defended privacy with a passion that had the quality of a moral craft. When a mix of volunteers arrived, some sincere, some grasping, she parceled out help in ways that minimized risk and avoided the glare. She and Henrique met several times to talk about the boys, about education, about the practical needs that the letter could not render in headlines. Therapy for the boys who had odd nightmares, a new mattress for a sleeping corner, enrollment in a school that would not ask questions that would complicate the children's mornings. The work of repair, both emotional and material, required many small acts. As the audit progressed, Aline uncovered more documents that tightened the noose around the pattern of decisions Alberto had made. The company's accounts showed transfers that had been intentionally obfuscated and instructions that had been given in the coded language of boardrooms, phrases like "handle quietly" and "prioritize discretion." The handwriting analysis further supported the claim that Lívia's signature had been used under circumstances that suggested coercion rather than consent. Lawyers began to speak of settlements and potential suits. Henrique felt the old room of privilege become a courtroom in his mind, and he did not like the feeling. Faced with the scale of the revelations, Henrique made a decision that surprised some and satisfied others. He would renounce the Valença name as his public badge. It was a gesture that would not by itself erase 6 years of choices, but it would be a tangible sign that he refused to let the house's old vocabulary of defense define him anymore. He wanted to disassociate his future from the language of covers and silences. He asked an old family lapel pin to be brought to him, an enamel badge passed down like a small talisman of lineage. Standing before a small group that included Aline Jonas and a legal representative, Henrique placed the pin on the table. The moment was not theatrically staged. It was the private calculus of someone who understood symbolism. "I will not hide behind a name that was used to silence people," he said. His voice was steady. "I will not take what was purchased at someone's cost." He tore the badge in two and set the halves in an envelope. The image of him ripping the insignia spread quickly, as these images do, not by a press release but by the small mechanical processes of people inside and outside his circle who felt the need to see such acts as meaningful. The press picked up the gesture and painted it in the language they preferred. Some called it symbolic, some called it self-inflicted casuistry. Henrique ignored the commentary. He sought a more consequential act. In the weeks that followed, he formally filed a document that would, in the public eye, mark a change. He would adopt another surname as his public identity, his mother's maiden name, Duarte. The legalities of renunciation of the family name were complex and slow, but to Henrique the act was a line drawn in the sand. He would not be the name under which the cover-up had been allowed to fester. He would carry responsibility in an active, accountable way. The choice to become Henrique Duarte was private and public. Friends murmured that he was making a statement. His father called it a betrayal. Henrique's reply was simple. A name should be an honoring, not a shield. From that decision came action. He announced the creation of a foundation, Aurora, with initial funding funneled from assets he controlled, not as an escape from the family wealth, but as an explicit attempt to redirect what had been used as armor into repair. The Aurora Foundation's purpose was straightforward: to provide resources for women and children who had been forced into invisibility, to fund shelters, legal assistance, psychological care, and art programs that could give voice and tools to reclaim lives. The founding was not a theatre for him to rebuild reputation. It was work. He met with Cecilia, listened to her assessment of what shelters actually needed, and spoke to Aline about governance and transparency. He wanted the foundation to be governed by people with lived experience, not just philanthropists who wrote checks and took photographs. Lívia agreed to participate on one condition. She would be anonymous, at least at first. Her role would be to advise on program design, but not to be the face. Henrique accepted. He had learned that public gestures did not have to be trophies for the giver. Planning the Aurora Foundation took months. It was a labor of small choices: the location of the first community center, the kind of programs to fund, the staff to hire. Henrique insisted on a board that included Cecilia and other shelter workers, and he insisted on transparency, open reporting, independent oversight, and community governance. He wanted the money to do its work visibly and without the old patterns of control. The Foundation's first major project was to fund the renovation of the shelter where Lívia and the boys lived. New bedding, a kitchen that could produce regular hot meals, a small art studio where Lívia could work and the boys could paint. They raised funds for school scholarships and for counseling. They also established a legal fund to help women challenge coercive contracts, small acts that would give people back the right to be named and unnamably free. As the foundation came into being, Henrique found himself moving through a different geography of life. He no longer arrived at family events with the opacity of a shielded heir. He went to the shelter and sat at low tables with other parents. He learned to carry paint in his sleeves and to tie shoelaces at the end of the day. He did not expect symphonies of forgiveness. He wanted steady presence. Lívia continued to work with the boys, teaching them the economy of craft, how color could be a map, and how a small canvas could contain a lifetime of feeling. She accepted, with a guarded generosity, an offer to participate in the Foundation's advisory board anonymously. She wanted to make sure the programs honored dignity, not pity. The weeks folding into months held small, luminous moments. There were mornings when the three boys would rush into the studio with paint on their palms and a serious look that contrasted with the childish joy in their movements. There were evenings when Henrique would bring home bread and sit at a table with Jonas and sound out plans not for profit, but for school enrollment, for the long patience of education. There were also long nights when he wrestled with the memory of his father's face in a hospital bed, when duty and guilt intersected. The public fallout continued in the way such things do. Inquiries, statements, resignations from board members who wished to distance themselves quickly from an unfolding scandal. The regulator's gaze remained. Alberto's recovery in the hospital was slow and intermittently reported. The family name carried friction like a live current that could not be ignored. Henrique did not know what would come of the legal investigations, settlements, charges. None of it was preordained. He learned to face ambiguity without falling back into the old language of protection. When Alberto finally left the hospital, he was a diminished figure. The man who returned to his house moved more slowly, and the control he had long exercised sagged under the weight of exhausted health. He refused at first to accept the depth of what had been revealed, but the world presses upon habit. The pressure from regulators and the moral force of the letter and Henrique's renunciation had changed the tenor of their household. There were conversations, sometimes heated and raw, between father and son. Alberto watched the Foundation's work with something like bewilderment, and sometimes in private he would ask questions about the boys, about painting programs, about the shelter staff. Henrique answered with a patient clarity that had not existed in their earlier exchanges. One slow afternoon, Henrique drove to the shelter with a box of art supplies and a nervousness he thought he had left behind. The plane of the sky was clear, and a light breeze came off the river. The boys greeted him with a kind of solemnity that made him laugh, a joy as precise as a bell. Mr. Duarte, Miguel said, using Henrique's new surname with the pointed politeness of a child discovering formality. Henrique felt the sound of the name in his mouth and found it honest. "At home, sometimes I have a boring tie," Henrique said. "Here, I get to have paint." They painted together on a large wall the shelter had set aside for community murals. Lívia watched from the corner, her hand resting on the smallest boy's shoulder. She had agreed, in a way that was not spoken, to be present in this new life. The mural grew, sweeping strokes of blue for sea, arcs of warm yellow for morning, and a small set of 3 stripes repeated like a motif, one for each boy. As they painted, the boys ran between colors, their laughter bright as thrown pebbles. The Aurora Foundation's inauguration was scheduled for a crisp autumn morning. It was modest by institutional standards, no ostentatious ribbon-cutting, no white-gloved benefactors. But it was full of people who had been part of the work. Shelter staff, volunteers, donors who had listened with patience, and neighbors who had once been wary of the shelter's presence. The atmosphere was both festive and careful. It held within it the dignity the shelter had always sought to preserve. Henrique walked to the front and for a moment felt his chest hollow with the weight of his choices. He thought of the letter, how the small, honest sentences had altered the trajectory of many lives. He thought of the boys painting stripes on the wall and of the way Lívia's hands had been busy for years, making beauty in tiny strokes. He spoke briefly. He did not offer dramatic proclamations. He acknowledged mistakes, he acknowledged failures, and he announced that the foundation would be funded for the foreseeable future to support programming for women and children who had been forced into invisibility. He spoke of transparency and governance, and of listening as a practice. He did not say the word atonement because it felt too grand. Instead, he promised continual work. After the small ceremony, they unveiled the mural. Lívia stepped forward, putting outward the small, private courage she had guarded for years, and she painted the final stripe. It was an act both simple and immense. Camera shutters clicked, not for sensation but for record. The 3 boys, paint spattered and solemn, stood near her like a constellation. When the day wound down, the group lingered around a table of sandwiches and tea. The children ran ahead to a yard where they raced paper boats down a gutter, guttering with a small stream. There were 3 small boats, Miguel's striped, Raphael's patched, Daniel's with a drawn sail. They sailed, staggered and overturned. The boys laughed and righted them with the practical intensity children have for the small tragedies of play. Later, as the light softened and the building's windows began to shine from within, Henrique and Lívia found themselves alone for a few minutes standing by the mural. The paint still smelled faintly of oil and sea. The night pressed close and soft. "I didn't want you to see them in the paper," Lívia said quietly. There was no accusation in the sentence. It was a fact she had kept like a life-preserver. "I know," Henrique said. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough sooner." She looked at him with a careful appraisal. "You weren't the only one who had to choose," she said. "I chose for them because I thought your life was worth more left whole." "You were right in a way," Henrique replied, thinking of all the complicated ways love demands sacrifice. "But that doesn't mean I'm not culpable. I had a life I could have used to help you." "I didn't." They did not fall into declarations. That was not the style of repair this history required. Instead, they did small things that looked like hope. Henrique helped lift a paint can. Lívia adjusted a brush in his hand. They tucked a small strip of the letter, a photocopied line folded into an envelope, into a locked drawer of the Foundation's office, not as a talisman of guilt, but as a reminder of the human cost of silence. Time measured itself in small improvements. The boys enrolled in a school near the shelter, where teachers learned the contours of their histories without making them a spectacle. Henrique spent evenings at board meetings, reading budgets instead of tasting power. He learned to find satisfaction in proper audits and well-run classes. The foundation published transparent reports and engaged community members in governance. Alberto occasionally visited the shelter, awkward in his attempts at reconciliation, bringing flowers and insisting on practical help. His presence was complicated. He performed small acts of generosity that required grace to accept. There were moments when the old family machinery tried to turn itself back on. Calls from distant relatives asking for allies, a whisper in the business world about power vacuums. Henrique answered with the new vocabulary he had chosen: openness, responsibility, listening. He resisted returning to the old defense. At home, the small rituals of family began to rearrange themselves into something that resembled a life. Dinner was often simple: soup, bread, a quiet conversation about schoolwork or paint colors. The boys learned to call him Henrique, and he learned to respond without the old stiffness. The name Duarte grew into him like a garment that finally fit. Lívia's art slowly returned to its place in the city. She began to show small works anonymously in a community gallery, artifacts of a private life with public value. One of her canvases, a seascape with 3 indistinct figures at the horizon, was purchased by a community program and placed in the shelter's common room. It was the sort of quietly public thing she had allowed herself to create. Visible, but not exploitative. The letter, which had once been the engine of revelation, settled into being a private document between the people who had lived its truths. Henrique kept the original folded and locked it in his desk. He made photocopies for the auditors and for legal counsel. It had not become an instrument of revenge. It had become a hinge on which possibilities turned. He read it now sometimes at night, not to stir fury, but to remember the human cost of systems he had once accepted. One evening, when the sky threatened rain again, Henrique walked with the boys to a small park. The air smelled like wet earth and something close to renewal. Miguel fell and scraped his knee. Henrique knelt and washed it with water from a bottle and pressed a bandage over the small wound. The boys sat clustered close, in a way that was both normal and miraculous. There was in that proximity a gentle ordinariness that Henrique had come to treasure. At the park's edge stood a small kiosk where a neighborly mural had been painted and where sometimes volunteers held workshops. Henrique watched the boys make little boats from folded paper and send them down a gutter fed by a lingering rain. The small vessels bobbed and corrected their course, and for a moment Henrique felt as if he watched future lives learning to steer. Lívia joined them with a thermos of tea. She sat on the bench and watched the boys, her profile like a calm sculpture. When she looked at Henrique, there was less armor now, and the look that passed between them was full of the weary language of people who had survived and were deciding, day by day, how to live. "We can paint tomorrow," she said, and it was an ordinary invitation that felt immeasurably generous. "Tomorrow," Henrique agreed. They did not promise everything. They did not erase the past with vows. They were careful and persistent, the kind of people who attend to small, sustaining acts. Henrique learned to carry a name that asked for accountability instead of entitlement. Lívia continued to protect her children fiercely, and she let him be present in ways that had been forbidden before. In time, the investigations wound through their formal processes. Documents were filed, statements taken. Some executives resigned amid scrutiny, and the company restructured elements of its governance. Words like allegations and inquiry remained attached to the story in the press. Some people called for harsher outcomes. Others called for the kind of forgetting that returns power to its old centers. Henrique did not control all of it. He controlled his actions. At the shelter's courtyard, a new mural took shape. It was larger than before, a sweeping horizon that included a small shoreline where 3 children stood together, their outlines not identical but connected. Lívia painted the sea, and Henrique, with clumsy but earnest strokes, added a boat. Miguel, Raphael, and Daniel painted the sky. The mural did not pretend to be a final image. It was a living thing that would be added to and repainted in years to come. When the Aurora Foundation turned its first year, the small celebration was modest but deeply felt. They gathered under the painted arch of the shelter's yard. Children ran circles, and adults shared food and quiet thanks. Henrique watched the three boys run one after another, their voices tumbling and undirected. Lívia stood near the mural with a cup of tea, paint on her fingers. Henrique felt, in the middle of that day, the long arc from the rain-soaked street to the present. A letter had opened the world between them, but it was the daily acts, the school enrollments, the therapy sessions, the paint-smudged hands that were making the future plausible. He thought of his father in the house that had once seemed unassailable. He thought of the ledger entries that had begun to be read like records of harm. He thought of the small scrap of paper in his drawer and of the responsibility he had chosen to carry. As afternoon softened into evening, a light drizzle began to fall. The rain motif that had once delivered memory now offered a quiet closing. The droplets were delicate and benign, washing the mural's colors to a shine. The children ran to the gutter to race their paper boats, and the three vessels carved small arcs through the shallow water. Henrique and Lívia sat on the low wall and watched. They did not need to fill the silence. The mural's colors gleamed. The boys' laughter filled the air. There was no grand reconciliation scene with sweeping declarations. There was instead a rebuilding, slow and available to the work of ordinary days. Henrique reached into his pocket and took out a small folded photocopy of the letter. He had kept the original private, but he carried a copy like a keepsake of what had been revealed and what had been chosen. He did not open it. He rested his hand over it and felt the small ridges of the fold. "You did what you thought was right then," Henrique said, turning to Lívia. The admission was less an absolution than an acknowledgement that choices had been deeply human. "And you did what you chose now," she replied. "We're not finished. We'll never be finished. But we're here." He looked at the boys, at the mural, at the shelter's softened walls. He thought of the name he had left behind and the one he had chosen. He felt at that moment that what mattered was not the march of public vindication, but the daily, imperfect work of building a life that honored truth. The drizzle thickened into a warm rain that left the concrete glistening. Miguel nudged his brothers, and together they made a small fleet of paper boats and launched them down the runnel. Henrique bent to help fold the next batch, his fingers sticky with glue from a craft he now performed with more facility than he expected. When night came, the shelter's lights glowed like a cluster of small beacons. Henrique walked home slowly, the letter's photocopy in his pocket, knowing it would rest in his drawer, and that its existence would still mark many days to come. He had no illusion that the journey from exposure to healing was a straight line. It was a path with many small repairings, many days of attending, and many more of steady work to undo the quiet violence of silence. In the months that followed, Aurora funded more programs. The boys grew into school routines, and Lívia's canvases joined the shelter's common room as quiet reminders of endurance. Alberto lived a life reduced in scale, but not in consequence. He watched and sometimes aided in small ways, and sometimes he retreated. The corporation restructured, and some of the men who had once made decisions behind closed doors resigned or were replaced. The investigations continued with the patient slowness of institutions. Henrique no longer sought to be the man who ran from his past. He aimed to be the man who used his resources to build something that could not be bought away. One evening, years after the rain that first returned Lívia to his life, Henrique stood by a window that looked out on a small courtyard. The mural across the street, rebuilt and cared for, caught the last light. In the shelter, through the reflected glass, he could see three small heads bent together over a table, drawing. They are forming themselves into something that was not just issue or news or the subject of a headline. They were forming into a family, uneven and real. Henrique thought of the letter and of how it had forced him to choose. He thought of the act of renouncing the name that had once seemed like inheritance and which had become an obligation. He thought of how names can be instruments of power and how repurposing them into instruments of repair is slow, difficult, and sometimes mocked. He did not expect his action to erase every consequence or to grant him absolution. It was, at best, a practice he intended to maintain. He closed the window and walked toward a small shelf where a shallow box lay. Inside, under other small relics, was the original letter, folded and quiet. He touched it with the care of someone who knew its value. It had done what it was meant to do. It had told a truth that could not be denied and opened the possibility of repair. He felt, without theatricality, gratitude to the woman who had refused to let her erasure be permanent. Outside, rain began again, gentle, insistent, the city breathing in cycles of wetness that had come to mean cleansing and revelation both. Henrique took a breath and sat down at his table. He pulled out a blank sheet of paper and, after a moment, wrote a note of thanks to Aline and Cecilia, to Jonas and to the volunteers. He wrote to Lívia a line that was not a plea, but an offer. "We will keep working. We will not forget." He folded the note and slid it into an envelope. The act felt measured and fitting, small paper gestures in a world that had been remade by written words. He would not promise miracles, only quiet commitments. Painted walls, proper schoolbooks, nights where the children could sleep without the shadow of someone else's ledger falling across them. The city was a net of light and rain, and within it a small patch of shelter glowed with new color. Henrique walked out into the evening, umbrella in hand, and headed toward the mural. The boys ran past him, their laughter scattering like bright coins. Lívia stood by the open door and watched him pass, and when their eyes met, there was no need for many words. The letter had done its work. Now the work was what would last. If this story moved you, subscribe for more true feeling stories of loss and second chances.